Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of A Real Talk with Rick. Really excited about this episode. I was able to bring in a resident of Eden Prairie whose family has been a part of the city for, over 120 years, I believe. Someone who's been a part of Eden Prairie dating back to the late 19th century, and that's Sever Peterson. Sever Peterson is iconic when it comes to Eden Prairie. Prior to me working here in Eden Prairie, I was familiar with the Sever vegetable stands where you could pick up, obviously, some of the best sweet corn around, or the corn maze and the festival that Sever and his family have run in Shakopee for a number of years. But there's so much more to his time in Eden Prairie and growing up in Eden Prairie and his family farming in Eden Prairie. So we get a little bit of that history all the way back through the 20th century, through all the work his children are even doing now and what they are harvesting. It's kind of interesting what they're doing now, some of the other crops that they're working on. And even more importantly, I think this is the first place or the first time Sever talks about what this year's corn maze theme is. So he's going to share that for the first time. So you absolutely have to listen to the entire podcast till we get to near the end where he reveals what this year's corn maze is going to be. So here is my conversation with Sever Peterson. Sever, thank you so much for coming in and sitting down and talking to us. We're really excited for this conversation.
It's nice to be here, Rick. It's thank you for inviting me. Wonderful to meet Johnny here today and see you again.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I've been able to have opportunities over the last 10 years that I've been here to talk with you and meet with you, but this is probably the longest conversation we're going to have. So this will be good. I'm excited. No, it'll be good. It's good. It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
I think so.
So Sever, could you maybe take us, because you're an iconic figure in Eden Prairie. Could you maybe take us back and talk to us about when you first how your family came to Eden Prairie and growing up here?
Well, my paternal grandfather and grandmother, they immigrated from Sweden, and they, I think they just wanted to get out of Minneapolis. They did some grocery work in Minneapolis. They had a little grocery store, as I understand. And then they came out to Eden Prairie, and where they started raising their family. They were born here and raised their family here, and the kids were educated here. And Eden Prairie was far enough out that I don't think it was too expensive for them. I don't think any of our ancestors at that time had a whole lot of money. They did it with their hands and with their will, and that's how they got it done. But yes, it was my paternal grandparents that settled here in Eden Prairie.
Yeah, and this would have been, in the late 19th century into the early 20th century.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, correct.
So where did they settle, and where did you grow up?
Well, they settled up where I'm just trying to think, off on the west side of County Road 4. And Hennepin Village but they didn't buy that property there. I think they were renting that property. And
okay.
Because I thought I understood my father said that he was born on top of the hill up there on the bluff. But then they bought property, which was right down alongside on the hairpin corner of County Road 4, below the Mitchell and the Reggae farm there. And that's where they then settled and made their home.
Okay. So yeah, you are Sever Peterson III.
That is correct.
That's correct. So then you've pretty much been here your whole life.
I've been here my whole life except for Vietnam time. That's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Sure. And then, so tell us a little bit about growing up here. I think you were the Eden Prairie class in 1962.
I don't know how you know that, but somebody must have let you know. But I was part of that class, and that was a neat class for me because we were a small class. There were more girls than boys, which all the boys loved.
Yeah.
And we were all neighborhood kids. We all, we knew one another's families, when we got to school. But I remember when I started school, I did not know colors. This is first grade. There was no kindergarten in 1950 when I started. And I remember learning my colors in school. I remember learning the alphabet in school and learning to read. And, my grandkids today, 4-year-olds, are reading words and know their colors and can count. I mean, it's amazing. But yes, I started in school here in 1950 and I think every class started with neat classmates, and it was small enough. Actually, we thought about it at the time. We always felt that we spent more time with our classmates than we almost did with our families, because when we were home for the evening, and most of that was for doing chores and eating and sleeping. Eden Prairie was a farm community. Not everybody was farmers. I would say but less than half of my class were from the farm.
Okay.
Some classes more, some classes less. But it was neat to grow up with these kids.
Yeah, so the majority, and that's a really, interesting comment about half, because through the 1950s, Eden Prairie was considered a farming community. Obviously, we have a lot of history related to that. What if a lot of the other kids, would it be that they lived on large tracts of land and maybe didn't work into farming or work in the land, or there's more developed neighborhoods at that time at all?
I would say that they did not live on large tracts of land. They probably, once in a few, very few. I think of one, for example, and I want to mention this family because it was the Schultz family in Eden Prairie.
Okay.
Warren and Madge Schultz. And they owned the property where we are sitting.
Okay.
And between here and Highway 5, their home was up there, and they owned it over to where the Eden Prairie Methodist Church is.
Okay.
And because I believe that Warren and Madge gave that property to the church to build it on after their other location, which was on the southeast corner of 4 and 1. And a kitty corner from the Rogers Marshall's Farm Market.
Okay.
The site of the current, what's the name of the church there, on large church down there?
Grace Church.
Grace Church.
Yeah.
On the it would have been their northwest corner of their property is where the Methodist Church was.
Okay.
And when that church burned down, Warren and Madge, I believe, gave them property. But Warren and Madge were very much a part of they had a daughter older than me, and they had a son younger than me. And neat kids, but wonderful people. They were active in our lives, and not daily active. Warren was a pilot with Northwest Airline, and Madge was a homemaker, but they were very much involved in the lives of the young people of Eden Prairie, and I can only stand on the table and applaud them. They were wonderful people.
Yeah, and like you said, all the kids your age and many of their parents you knew.
Oh, yes.
You knew most everybody and where most everyone lived.
Yeah. I would say, Rick, on that note, we like to say, and it's not entirely true, but we think it's true, that we knew everybody by the car they drove.
Oh, sure.
And
yeah.
You may not even know where they lived, but you knew the car they drove.
The car they drove, sure.
And for, if you remember right, there weren't that many cars. People didn't have 2 and 3 car garages because they didn't need 2 and 3 car garages, but you knew them by the car they drove, and after the age of about 9 years old, I think every boy knew every model of every car.
Do you remember your first car?
My first car?
Yeah, first car you drove.
I do.
Yeah.
Not the first car I ever drove or the first car I ever bought, because we started driving pretty young.
Okay, I suppose. So you probably were driving quite a bit before you were 16 years old.
Let's
go with the first one you drove. And then the first one you bought. I want to hear both.
Well, the first one I drove, I would say was about a 49 Chrysler.
Okay.
And I was probably 6 years old, but that sounds quite young, and I wasn't driving
It is
in
quite
1949, but I was driving in the first grade. I went up and plowed the church lot. We had a Jeep, and I'd go up and plow the church lot, and I didn't think anything of it, and I mean, I drove it all over the farm.
So I don't know what I would think, Sever, right now of a 7-year-old plowing a church lot. I don't know what I'd think of that today, but I guess
me also
back then.
Well, I wasn't the only one. I mean,
sure,
it's
all good.
You did but yeah, it was they were different times.
Yeah. First car you bought.
The first car I bought was a used car, and it was a 1969 Cadillac convertible.
Really?
Yeah, and my brother came to me and said, "You got to buy this car." He watched the newspaper. I've never looked at a newspaper for an ad, but he shopped that way, I think. And he said, "You got to buy this car." And I bought that 1969 Cadillac, and it was a nice car. I wish I had it today.
I wish you did too. So the first car I think I drove in was a 1972 Ford Galaxy. In the mid 80s, but I think the first car I bought was a Toyota Camry, so that's not really exciting. Not as exciting as your Cadillac.
The first car of anything. The first bicycle was exciting, I think, for every one of us here in America.
Absolutely. How about you getting involved in farming? How did that happen? Was it a matter of something that was in the family that you continued? How did that come to be?
My siblings and I, we grew up on the farm where we are there, right on County Road 4, which was then, it's now Flying Cloud Drive. It was then 169, and we still live there. And I have one sister a year younger than me, and she was very much involved in agriculture as well. She drove every truck on the farm. And she learned a year earlier than I learned how to drive, because we learned together in our dad's lap. He'd let us drive, and we'd kind of compete for who got to steer and then who finally got to drive and so on. But and my younger sisters, they were also involved in the farm, not to the extent the older sister was. But, she would do the planting. She did a lot of the cultivating. She could do the harvesting. We had a tandem truck at the time, which was quite a large truck in the 60s. She drove that into the Minneapolis, St. Paul, to deliveries. And she was a year younger than me in school, married a classmate of hers. She married a classmate. That was fun.
Yeah.
He was a good friend of mine. I never dreamt that my best friend would end up married to my sister, but, a small school. So it was really fun. But, I think every farm, they did what they had to do, and if whatever it was you had to do it, you did it.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's something then that you stayed with that. You talked about going to Vietnam. So you're obviously, that's part of being drafted.
Yeah. Well, let me back up a minute.
Okay.
You asked me a question about the farm.
Yeah.
I don't know that I thought I would farm the rest of my life, but I certainly never thought anything else, that I would be a bricklayer or that I'd be an electrician or I'd be a dentist or something. That just didn't occur to me. And but my mother really believed in education. My mother had some college, and then she met my father. Her advisor suggested that she not drop out of college and marry my father, but she did. The rest is history. My father graduated from Gould School here, 8th grade in Eden Prairie. That was the extent of his education. But like everybody else that went to school however many years, their education continued with their daily activities and their family interactions and reading and so on. And my dad was an avid reader. But for me, I don't know that I thought it any different, but I loved working with my dad, my brother, my sisters, my mother on the farm. Now, my mother wasn't out driving tractors, as many women were, including my sister.
Yeah.
But, I never thought about it any different. But my dad died shortly after I came back from Vietnam.
Okay.
And none of us expected that. In the meantime, something really significant had happened in our lives, and that is that I at that time, I attended a small private college in St. Paul, McAllister College, my first 2 years. My mom wanted me to go to a small school. I didn't even think I was going to college. I mean, I thought after I graduated high school that, well, I was under the impression the sun not only rose, but it set on Eden Prairie, Minnesota. And why would I ever go anywhere else? And that wasn't an arrogant thing. I just didn't have a vision beyond Eden Prairie, Minnesota.
Sure.
I had no vision for that.
Yeah.
But after my 2 years at Mac, and I told my mother, I said, I'll go 1 year, but then I want to go over to the university for ag school. If I'm going to go around to school, I'd like to be some agriculture in it. She said, that'd be fine. Well, after 1 year at Mac, I really enjoyed it.
Okay.
So I stayed 2 years and got a lot of my prerequisites out of the way.
Right.
And then I transferred to the U. And while I was at the U, my first year at the U and St. Paul campus, I met a young man from Germany. And he was in at least one of my classes, and I was quite impressed with him, and we enjoyed one another's company, had, some social time together. And I found out that he was part of an exchange program, an agricultural exchange program, through the University of Minnesota. And we talked about it, and one day he said, Sever, you ought to think about, maybe being a host for this. Might be something your family would be interested in. Boy, I went home every weekend, but I went home that weekend quite excited about that, shared it with my mom and dad, and they embraced that. And my sisters, and we had a small farmhouse. It was just every bedroom was full. There weren't extra bedrooms in the farmhouse, but we put another bed in my bedroom, and I shared the bedroom, and we started. That was in 1965, our first exchange student. But after that exchange student was at our farm, and I'm sorry this is such a long story. But
no, this is good. From where was the first exchange student from?
He was from Germany.
Got it.
And he hadn't been on our farm very long, and I realized that he didn't come to our farm in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, or any other farm to learn how to farm, or to learn how to drive a plow, or to learn how to run a planter or a harvester. He knew those things, and he knew how deep the planet and how many seeds per foot and how many seeds, per acre and so on. I mean, and I thought, well, if he didn't come for that, why did he come? He's got a farm in Germany. I mean, the sun rises and sets on that farm too. I mean, why would he leave?
Yeah.
Well, as the year progressed, I realized that he wanted to see a little bit more of the world beyond his farm gate. And it really opened my eyes, and I think the eyes of my siblings as well, that there is a world out there beyond Eden Prairie. And it was a time that all of us are growing up. Granted,
Sure.
These are the years
Right.
that all of us are growing up. But that was for me a real springboard to wake me up and say, hey, there's something else out there besides Eden Prairie. And nothing wrong with Eden Prairie. Here I am back in Eden Prairie, and I love every minute of it. But that became a real important part of our life, because they became like brothers and sisters to us. Their kids are like nieces and nephews to us. It's wonderful to visit them and so on.
No, that's a great program. So yeah, you've got the 2 years at McAllister, and then you're going to the U, and then you're in the exchange program, or that you would. Did you ever go over there as part of the exchange?
Not as part of the exchange. I would have liked to have, but I didn't feel I could leave the farm that long.
Sure.
I just didn't feel I could. The university asked me if I would work with them on a project in not in Peru, in Chile.
Okay.
And they had a research farm down there in Chile, and they asked me if I would, and I asked them for how long would the commitment be, and they said 2 years. I couldn't leave our farm at that time. Not that I was so instrumental in it, I just didn't feel that I could be away that long.
Sure. Did you finish up at the University of Minnesota
I did.
then?
Yes,
Okay.
I did.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then you went
I left almost from graduation day to Vietnam.
Really?
Yeah.
And then then you come back. So what's the time frame that you were there? It sounds like you were there pretty early.
Yeah,
then
I was there. I was there first in 1967. I was there in March of 1967. I arrived in Vietnam, and then I came home, And then I was there again in '68. I was not military. At the time, I was opposed to the war, but I was not opposed to my country. I was not opposed to the political system of my country, but I was opposed to some of the decisions they were making, but nevertheless, as my country, have to work with it.
Which I think a vast majority of people your age at that time probably felt.
I would say so.
A large,
I would
not
say
a
so, absolutely. And the reason I don't just say absolutely is because many of us didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
It was conscription.
Right.
And many people were conscripted to go
Right.
To the military.
Right. And some left the country to avoid it.
Some did.
But when you said that you went, it wasn't you said not an active military.
That's right.
What did you do then?
I worked in agriculture and construction. I worked at a hospital.
Okay.
And I was building buildings for the hospital. I was working on keeping the staff, and they had a training. It was a medical relief organization that I was working with, and called Project Concern.
Okay.
And it was a very interesting program. They had a training program for the local people, and many of them were native Vietnam people, which were not of Asian descent, but rather of Polynesian descent, the Montagnards. And it was the Montagnards. That was a 15th century culture, hand-woven skirts, and men wore loincloths. But it was a fascinating culture, absolutely wonderful people,
wow.
Brilliant people, and many of them spoke several languages: Chinese, Vietnamese, their own dialects, and English. But many of them, the Montagnards, that became a complication for many of the Montagnards, because the American military used many of them in our efforts in Vietnam. So when we pulled out of Vietnam, it became very, very difficult for that ethnic group. But Vietnam was, it was an interesting time for me, this medical relief program.
Yeah. And then you talked about how you came back, and then your dad had suddenly passed away.
Yes.
Soon after that, and then that had kind of a different effect then on what you did in terms of the family farm then.
Well, it did. When I came back, I thought, I kind of enjoy seeing some other parts of the world. In fact, on my second trip in Vietnam, I went with another boy from Eden Prairie. He was a year younger than me in school, Mike Kerber.
Okay.
And Mike is not physically well in these days, but he was a gifted artisan with building. And we built several buildings while we were there. We even we even broke up rocks and used them to make an absolutely wonderful rustic fireplace in one of the dining rooms that we built. And so that was very interesting. But without Mike's skill, we wouldn't have been able to do that, or I wouldn't have been able to do that on my own. But with Mike's skills, we were able to do that. But that was great to be there with him.
Yeah, and so then tell me about farming in the 70s and 80s. What happened then?
Well, when I came home from Vietnam, actually when Mike and I left the second time, we had to be quarantined. They said, we found out that we would have to be quarantined for 2 weeks. And they said, and I said, well, where are we going to be quarantined? They said, well, you can go to Japan, you can go to Hawaii. It gave us, it didn't sound like bad alternatives, but I thought, in my history books, I read about places like, Egypt that had pyramids, and Greece that had an Acropolis, and Rome, the fantastic places that we'd only read about in history books. So Mike and I got talking about it, and we said, well, if we got to, and we were eager to get home because spring was coming, and he was a farm boy also.
Yeah.
Right off Highway 5 up here.
Okay.
And we said, well, why don't we add a little more time to it, take a trip home around the world. We don't have to quarantine anywhere. We'll go, we'll go into Thailand and see a bit of Thailand. Then let's get over to India and see the Taj Mahal. And every place was so interesting for us. I remember landing in India, and all the rickshaws Oh my goodness, were there rickshaws. And we didn't know a soul in India. And but we had a great time in each one of these stops, and we were glad we did that. But when I got home, I thought, well, I kind of enjoy traveling. So we finished the season out at home that year. That would be 1968. The fall of 68, I thought, I'd kind of like to do a little traveling. And actually, I stayed home for 2 years. In the fall of 69, another friend and I thought we could drive to South America. And we thought, well, let's drive until we find out we can't.
Yeah.
And we found that out in Panama. And we didn't find out.
You drove all the way to Panama, though?
We drove to Panama.
Yeah.
1969. And
yeah,
actually,
that's impressive because I didn't think you'd get, very deep into Mexico. That's pretty good.
Well, we made it to Panama, and we were thinking we'd make it even further. And we maybe could have. But we didn't know how hard we dare press it. And they said, well, you might make it with a motorcycle, but there were no maps, and nobody was there to say, well, I've done that, or we do it all the time, or here's the route you take, or, this guy will guide you. No, it was, and we'd had a hard enough time getting through Central America in a couple places.
Yeah.
And so anyway, we left the car in Panama and flew to Bogota, Colombia, and then we bussed down through in South America. And I got as far as Lima. My mother would send me letters, please hold for Sever Peterson, general delivery, Lima, Peru. So I go to the main post office in Lima, Peru, pick up my mail. Now, when I got to Lima, my mother had a letter for me that my dad wasn't well. And that comes to your question.
Yeah.
My dad wasn't well, and I spent half a day trying to figure out how I could call home. And I called home, and my dad, he'd gone to the doctor because his finger was infected, and they wanted to amputate his arm.
Wow.
And he said, no, don't do that. But she said, you better come home.
Yeah.
So I came home.
Okay.
And my father, I got home before my father passed away. My brother was in Australia. He was on the mission field in Australia. And we got a hold of him, and he came home as well. And we didn't know my dad was going to pass. None of us did. But that was a shock for us.
Yeah, that's all very sudden.
But there was the farm then.
Right.
We were then coming up to your question of the farm. I thought, well, we've got to continue. We had sweet corn, and we had customers, Lunds. We were, 2-generation supplier of sweet corn to Lunds, which was then Hoves, became Lunds, and now it's Lunds Byerly's.
Yeah.
But so it was. I just came into it. Sometimes I thought, well, if I'd had a mentor in my life and maybe a different track, would I have taken it? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like, you were taking it kind of day by day, year by year. Just from what I'm hearing from you, you were just living life as it came, and you were able to travel, and you were able to do quite a bit. But it wasn't a matter of I'm going to do this with my adult life, or this is my plan. You were in college, and then you were traveling, and you were part of the Vietnam War. So it was just a matter of whatever comes. And it sounds like, the next thing you know, it's harvest, and we've got to get to market, and that's what I'm doing.
All exactly true.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah.
Just listen to this for the first time.
Exactly.
So it's interesting then. Were a lot of the crops and the work that you were doing then, was it mainly sweet corn? Because I know, soybeans are big and sweet corn. Were there a lot of different crops?
Well, we had soybeans and we had field corn, but they were more of a rotation for us for our sweet corn. Sweet corn was our biggest crop.
Okay.
At that time, it was all hand harvested. And it was a lot of hot work, because to be on the sweet corn field on a day like today, at 88 degrees and humid, there's no wind. The corn's 7 feet tall in the sweet corn, and it was hot. But it was hot and hard work. But you started at daylight with the harvest, and we tried to be done by 1 o'clock each day with the harvest. And if we needed more, we'd try to have a little bigger crew. And my sister would go into Minneapolis and pick up people. There were still many people after the Second World War that were looking, I'm going to say, looked for day work, and they'd be day laborers for the farm.
Yeah.
And that worked out quite well for us. But that was our life. That was what my sister and brother and I knew on the farm, and so we continued that.
Sure. And then, as far as what I remember of your farming too, it is mainly crops. Were you ever in the livestock business?
Yes. Interesting you asked that. We had cattle and hogs as I grew up, chickens also, but mostly cattle and mostly cattle. And we sold those before I left for Vietnam. I'll never forget it. And we sold registered polled Herefords for 12.5 cents a pound. 12.5 cents a pound. Yeah, registered. They were, and that was good breeding stock. It was a sad day. That's a day that I will remember in my life. It wasn't a traumatic day. It was a sad day. And I never went back in the cattle business. But then when I came back, I was more, I enjoyed some traveling in the wintertime. My dad was not well enough to take care of cattle. And so we never got back into the cattle.
Okay. Yeah. Do you, this kind of brings us to the present day. Do you still do quite a bit of traveling off season then? Do you leave for the winter?
I try to get out of the country somewhere every winter for a month or 6 weeks.
Okay.
And I like South America.
You've been going. Okay, I was going to ask you what are your favorite places to visit? So South America, kind of yearning back to those the taking your car through there. You don't have to drive through there again. But
I think my favorite culture is the East Indian culture, the Indian culture. I love that. We had an exchange student from India after Mike and I were there in 1968, and he came in 1977 to the farm, and he was actually with us for 2 years, 77 and 78, and I've been back 6 or 7 times to visit him. And I really enjoy India. I take friends with me if they're interested to go many times. But I spend most of my time traveling in South America. But most of our exchange students have been in Europe. So Sharon and I, my wife Sharon and I have been to Europe one time and visited the northern tier students, but we want to go one more time. COVID interrupted us, but we hope that next year we could get over and visit the southern tier of Europe.
Okay, so when we talk about the northern tier of Europe, you're talking about into Scandinavia.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Okay.
We went for a wedding for a young man that I'd met in Brazil from Denmark, and he's managing a farm for Danish investors there in Brazil. And he's a young man, and then he married a Brazilian lady in Denmark, and his mother and sister had come over and traveled with Sharon and I to the Grand Canyon to West United States. We drove, so that was a wonderful trip with them. We got acquainted with his family, and then his mother has a farm there in Denmark. And she and her daughter, they farm that farm, rent it out, but they raise flowers and for roadside sales.
Oh, sure.
And kind of pick your own. And it's been very interesting for them. Now they're in their 4th year. But we started in Denmark, then we went into Sweden and Norway, and then back down into Germany and home.
Sure. Oh, that's fascinating. If I recall, a part of Holland and Denmark, there's flowers are a huge. Is that? I thought that was. I haven't been there before, but it's kind of a big deal there.
I've not been to what you and I are thinking of, and Johnny too, maybe. And maybe Johnny's seen them. I haven't also not seen them, but I've seen pictures of the flowers in the Netherlands.
Okay,
they're just spectacular.
That's what I've heard.
But I think it's a springtime thing, and we're usually going in the center of summer. But we changed our sweet corn operation, so it frees up us to have some summer time to get away if we want to. We're doing sweet corn time, it would have just been impossible to get away.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I want to lead up to, the Sever. When we hear Sever, we think about the vegetable stands and the corn maze, and I want to get to that, getting up to present day. I want to ask you a couple questions about that. But what, in terms of farming, obviously, different, there are many pests that can cause problems, right? I mean, have you had issues over the years where you've kind of had to kind of fight against some outside forces that might be hurting your crop at all?
Well, yes.
I just kind of want to hear about how you handle that or what you
insects,
do. Like right now, drought is an issue, correct?
Drought
We're
is
dealing with
very
that
much
right
of an
now.
issue.
That's another thing.
Drought is an issue. And we irrigate a lot of our sweet corn. And I've said to Sharon at least a half a dozen times here in the last month, I am glad we don't have sweet corn this year for all the irrigating we'd have to be doing.
Yeah.
And it's so time consuming and almost backbreaking, if you will. But as far as pests are concerned, we tried to minimize our chemical use on our products. My son of the next generation, and he really handles the production side of our farm. And that's corn and soybeans primarily now, and hemp. He's got into the hemp.
I heard about the
business
hemp.
as well.
I want to ask. Yep.
But he's very much involved in going organic. We started that yet when we were still with vegetables. We were not 100% organic, but and to be 100% organic with a crop like sweet corn, I don't know how you can keep the worms out of the sweet corn. You need customers that are willing to buy an ear of corn that has a worm in it. And I can tell you, there's not very many customers that really like to do that.
Sure.
And but we don't have that situation anymore. We just raise corn now for what we sell at our fall festival. But coming back to Aaron, is that he's gone very organic. Even his hemp is organic.
So Sever, tell me about the hemp, because this is kind of a new development about Aaron getting into hemp. When did this happen, and how? Tell me how that started and how that's been going.
That's a question I think you may have to ask somebody else, and starting with him. But I can tell you, it started 3 years ago.
Okay.
And it was now you're hearing it from a father's perspective, if you will, from the outside.
Sure.
It was a lot of work, a very steep learning curve. I don't claim to have conquered. I don't claim that we have conquered anything, but I know that Aaron has learned a lot. And our son-in-law, Mitch Michelson, he's involved with Aaron. Mm-hmm. They overlap in all of the operation. Aaron spearheads the hemp operation and Mitch the festival operation, but they work together on many things. But they are very much involved in now they're processing the hemp, and they're using it in health aids and
for all the CBD oil.
Exactly.
See, the reason, and I'm not asking you to be the expert, and I'm not either, but when the CBD oil thing took off, and then even when we talked, our city did, to some different providers or growers for medical marijuana, which is legal in Minnesota. A lot of what is grown, it seems so complex in terms of how you have to make sure that the is it THC, that you don't have
Correct.
any THC, and then the I don't know what department, but somebody comes out and they're constantly testing to make sure that you don't go over some very, very small limit. So it seems really complicated.
It's very complicated, I would say, and you're hitting it on the head. But I think that some of those parameters may widen in the future, because from what I do understand is that CBD oil is a phenomenal product.
Yeah.
To be used in so many ways that we don't even know, but with today's technology and expertise, but because it's basically been illegal and couldn't be done, and now it's got very, as you say, very thin parameters. But as those widen and as the uses become more obvious to our culture and the world's culture, I believe that it has quite an interesting future.
So last question on this: if you take 40 acres and you put hemp versus soybeans or corn, what is can there be a different yield there depending on what might be more lucrative or what the future would be? Or, I mean, I'm just thinking, okay, we got this 40 acres and we're going to put hemp on it instead of X, Y, or Z because, depending on what happens in the future, this could be a major boon of some sort?
Well, I think that the next generation, our family, looked at it really from they were excited about the product more than even the profit. Although at the time we started that year, 3 years ago or whenever it was, now again, you're hearing it from the dad's perspective, not totally involved.
Yeah, we'll get them in sometime. We'll do a whole hemp episode.
But they, what I understood the profit potential to be far exceeded any corn or soybean crop that could possibly be grown, no matter what the price per bushel would ever be.
Okay.
But by the time that crop that we harvested that year came for sale, it was less than 1/10 of the value.
Okay.
And not only was it less than 1/10 of the value, there really was virtually no demand for it. It just derailed. And why exactly, I don't know. But thankfully, well, I'm going to say thankfully, our son and our family was involved in it because he really believed that this is a product that's going to be good for mankind and for human beings.
Sure.
And in many ways. And so they are working with it daily, not only growing it, but processing it, etc.
Okay.
And what they do, I don't know, but it's not very lucrative yet. In fact, I don't think lucrative is part of the vocabulary yet.
Okay, fair enough. No, that's interesting. Let's get back to then corn and corn. And so I think I took my kids when they were younger to your festival when it was near Canterbury. And obviously, I think that's been redeveloped and you've relocated. I haven't been to your new location yet. I think you've been there 2 or 3 years now. But I see that you're coming up on the 25th anniversary of the corn maze and the fall festival, Sever. Is that true?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
So do you have the maze mapped out yet?
We do have the maze mapped out. Not only do we have it mapped out, but we have it cut out.
Okay.
And we cut it with hoes, so it's done by hand. I mean, every plant has to be taken out individually.
Wow.
And but it makes for neat and precise rows, and we like to have a map. We like people to have a map. We like to think of people orienteering their way through the activity. But this year, and I asked if I could share this with you, and they said absolutely.
Awesome.
But it's mythical creatures. Mythical
creatures.
Yes. And that's coming from the 5th generation of the family.
Okay.
Yeah. My grandchildren, they're the ones that said, why not do mythical creatures? So here we go with mythical creatures.
Yeah. No, it's funny because looking at some of the previous mazes, because you would do, some stuff based on like maps of the world and the United States, different countries. You've done stuff for the Twins who I like, the Vikings who I don't. But I've seen some animal stuff, some mythical creatures. Are we talking like dragons and?
I don't know what they refer to as mythical creatures.
Right.
When I'm in there hoeing, I don't see the whole thing.
All right.
And I don't have the map with me. I just am hoeing the rogues, if you will, the ones that get missed.
Because this will open up. Is it typically right around Labor Day, right?
Yes, it opens up the Friday after Labor Day is our opening day. The Friday after, Friday after Labor Day, exactly.
Okay. No, it's a big attraction. A lot of people enjoy going there. When the other thing too is the vegetable stands. Talk a little bit about kind of that business and what you ended up doing with the vegetable stands.
Well, we at that time, Sharon's mother and her husband, my wife Sharon and her husband, were daily out on the farm, different activities, whatever they could be helping with, and this is probably almost 30 years ago now. And we were we were wholesaling corn. We were wholesale, and Sharon's father-in-law, if you will, my father-in-law, if you will, Sharon's stepdad, he suggested that because we were renting the Northup King farm right here in Eden Prairie, and he said, golly, why don't you put a stand up there? And our kids really gravitated to that. Our daughter was very young at the time, but Aaron was preteen, far preteen. He was just starting school. But they got a kick out of that, and they enjoyed handing sweet corn to people. But that's where it started, right here in Eden Prairie.
No, that it's one of the things that, not growing up here, not being from here, Severs is the stands is what people would talk about coming out here to buy your retail.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, there is a difference in varieties of vegetables, especially sweet corn.
Mm-hmm.
But that's another reason that we are no longer in it, because of genetics.
Mm-hmm.
We can now eat corn that's raised in Florida or Georgia or another place, and we were starting with those varieties ourselves, because we went down to Mississippi, we went down to Indiana, we were planting in Iowa and those various places to try to start the season a little earlier. But we were starting, the varieties. We can eat corn in February now that is actually quite good because of genetics.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, and Minnesota does not have, I'm going to say, the Minnesotans don't have the compulsion to get out and eat that homegrown corn, because we haven't been able to eat any other corn. It just didn't have the flavor. Now it does have the flavor.
Yeah, that's a good point with genetics, because isn't it the same with apples and so many other vegetables where there was a seasonality to it, and it was a very specific seasonality to it, and that was it. And now
Apples,
that's a great point.
Peaches, grapes. You can get a peach that's so juicy and delicious. But I'm not saying any of this to denigrate the local grown products, because we cannot get it fresher than local grown. And when you know the supplier, if he's chemical free, if he's organic, their ethics, you get to know those things about your local grown products.
Yeah, and I mean, the CSA programs are really taking off for
Excellent.
people. They can visit the farms, the locations, they can get to know the product they're getting. It's great. It's great. And you get to know, my kids learn through our subscription to CSA, the when and how fruits and vegetables are grown. I've had to explain to Johnny here that, no, Johnny, in a local CSA box, we're not going to get bananas and grapes. They're just not from the area. So Johnny learned that over a period of time. So, it's you learn a lot.
So there's hope for me.
You've always known. It's just Johnny's just learned over the last 4 or 5 years.
Johnny coached me. He catch me up.
Yep, they're not growing grapes in southern Eden Prairie, but it's okay. It's okay. A lot of good corn. So, Sever, is there anything else, kind of wrapping up here? I want you to be able to share kind of anything else you might, have thought about when I asked you to be a part of the conversation in terms of Eden Prairie, your time here, some of your favorite thoughts about Eden Prairie. I want to be able to give you the floor here before we wrap up.
Well, I was fortunate enough to grow up in a generation that I still knew a number of the old timers, like the Jarrett family and various members of the Kopesky family. The Kopesky family, they were all berry growers, but they had a wonderful market over on it was then 169 on the way into Edina. Oh, it was a fabulous market. And their son and daughter were a little ahead of me in school, but they were it was fun to know these families.
Were they into the raspberries?
Yes.
Okay, because I used to be in Hopkins, so we've got the Raspberry Festival. It was just this last
absolutely.
weekend, so they talked about the old raspberry farms in Hopkins.
Well, you had the Holastics, you had the Brens, and I hate to start naming because
name
I
them.
leave people out, but Kerbers here in Eden Prairie were such a part of the community. The Dimmler family, the Skronka family, the Clark family, the Anderson family, and such fun, neat people. I was lucky to grow up with them, but I mentioned Moran family. But I think of Lori Jarrett And Jarrett is an old name in Eden Prairie, and those of my generation, and my generation's, we have less time left than we've had thus far. But it was very interesting, I believe, for all of us to know some connections into that early generation here in Eden Prairie. The Mitchells, we can just name them all. There was one interesting thing, a classmate of mine, and he was beloved by grades above and below, but they had a square dance barn in Eden Prairie. And it was located over in eastern Eden Prairie, east of what was then the Flying Red Horse, Jesse Schwartz's Flying Red Horse. Yep. And then if you grew up in Hopkins or spent time there, you might have known a place called the Green Barn. And well, it after the Woodward family, that was the Woodward family that ran, and it was a square dance barn. In the summer, they went out to national parks, and he was a square dance caller in national parks for campers and so on. And his son, my age, he'd come back with the most wonderful stories. The rest of us, if we got out of Hennepin County, it was a big deal, and so for him to share these experiences, but it was a fun time to grow up. It was a simple time to grow up. Jet airplanes came, television came in my lifetime. Certainly cell phones came in my lifetime, certainly iPads, but professional sports teams came in my lifetime. But it was a much simpler life. I'm not saying that I don't love the life today. Mm-hmm. It's been an interesting ride. But it was a simple time to grow up, and I'm glad to have been a part of that.
Yeah, no, that's great. And again, a big part of having you, be a part of this podcast is to share your recollections of some of those families and those people in that time. So I really appreciate that.
Well,
yeah.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun to be here with you and Johnny, and I love your ribbing of Johnny. That's great.
Yeah, there's so much more of that happens when we're not recording, but I always like to get a little bit in while we're recording.
I hope I get to spend a little time at it. Good.
Well, thanks, Sever.
Johnny, Rick, thank you very much.